Indigenism is a part of understanding that we as Indigenous peoples are a part of a larger system. And there might be governments, and there's deoccupation, decolonization, that part of it's really important. But we also have to look at how are the systems of our people that made it possible for us to be healthy.
Aloha mai kākou. My name is Malina Kaulukukui, and I am just honored to be here to interview and talk story with Dr. Kalamaoka'aina Niheu. I was asked to conduct the interview because I myself am in healthcare. I'm a retired social worker, and I am a cultural practitioner of hula, ho'oponopono, and lua. I'm going to introduce Dr. Niheu in a very Western manner, and I know that she will want to tell a little bit about herself on a more personal note. So, Dr. Kalamaoka'aina Niheu is a Kanaka Maoli family physician and associate medical director for the COVID response at Lifelong Medical Care. She is also the co-founder of the Standing Rock Healers Council and the Mauna Medic Healers Hui, and physician for Onipa'a na Hui Kalo, a Hawaii-wide coalition for the revitalization of Native Hawaiian traditional kalo farming and food sovereignty. Her published works include The Impact of the Military Presence in Hawaii on the Health of the Kanaka Maoli, Pu'uhonua, Sanctuary and Struggle at Makua, Hawaii, Indigenous Resistance in an Era of Climate Change Crisis, and Standing Rock Violence and the Militarization of Police. Kalama, please tell us more about yourself.
Aloha aina, Kalamaoka'aina Niheu, ko'uyunoa. Palikua ana ko'olau ka papa mo kohina. My name is Kalamaoka'aina Niheu. My father is Velokihe Akia'ailoa Soli Niheu, and his family comes from the island of Niihau. My mother is Gwendolyn Apune Kim, and that side of the family is from Korea, but she grew up in Kahalu. I am very honored to be here with Malina. I'm so impressed by the work of the kumuhula in the prisons, and I would love to learn more about that as we talk further. But for myself, just to give you a little bit of background about who I am, my parents met on the rooftop of the occupation at Kalama Valley, and that's where my name comes from. So Kalamaoka'aina means, in one interpretation, light of the land or torch of the land. In another interpretation, it means the fire that feeds us. And for my parents, naming me was a part of honoring that historical time, which really is considered one of the pua of the Hawaiian people, in which we started reclaiming through our bodies and our culture and through our language, our right to be Hawaiian. Before the utilization of Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka Oiwi, prior to that point, if those of us who study the history, all the way from 1893 all the way up into the 70s, our history was very brutally repressed. And it was during this time of understanding, reconnecting to our land, reconnecting to our communities, that there is this blossoming of inspiration that really led to eventually, the Punana Leos, looking at the Polynesian Voyaging Society, Waiahole Waikane, and there was a ever further, I think, growth And now you can see it blossoming all over all of the planting, all the kanu that people did all throughout the decades. And I'm very lucky to be somebody that's a recipient of the iki of our ancestors and our kupuna, because the alehele is long and it's hard. And I'm very fortunate to be a part of the pathway that has been laid out before me, because while we forge pathways as we go forward, we only get so far because of our ancestors and what my parents did for me and their parents did for them. And for me, I think one of the things that I try to guide me in the work that I do is that to try and be a good ancestor. So at least try to do some of the honor of what our ancestors did with the ku'e petitions and all that they sacrificed for. I try to do my best to also just be like, hey, your sacrifice is worth it.
So in listening to you, what I'm hearing is that your genealogy is important, and naming in our culture is so important. Mm-hmm. So let me just stay with that. How has your genealogy, the fact that your dad and mom were both activists, mm-hmm. and your naming has impacted your journey in that field of activism and your passion?
Sure. Great question. And I wanted to actually take it back a couple of generations. It's actually, if you look in the book Niheu, one of the first pictures that you'll see is Alice Niheu. And Alice Niheu was one of the great healers of Niheu. And she was, my direct ancestress. And so through this line of healing, I learned from the Kanaka side of me. And then also, my mother, part of what she did was when she was pregnant with me, my grandmother, she became a quadriplegic, and she cared for her in our home. And we learned how to do it like people cook rice. We learned to change diapers, drop nasal gastric tubes from the time we were little. We took care of her for 23 years in our home. But that caring, that ohana, that sense of community, that obligation to healing to our community, I learned from both sides of my mo'okuauhau. So what happened is when I grew up, I think sometimes it's a huge thing to be the daughter of giants, because you get expected to do so much. The basic expectations of the people that I was raised with, Papa Kikuni Blaisdell, my father, people like, Gregory was, somebody that helped me out through medical school. So many of those folks I grew up with, and I thought that they were regular people, So part of that world that I grew up with, I grew up believing that the extraordinary was what we should all be. And that was a heavy burden on me. I think that was a heavy burden for anyone to have. So what happened is during my undergraduate, I actually went away to Massachusetts because I wanted to get away from this burden, this huge burden that my parents put on me, that I'm supposed to be the light of the land, and I'm supposed to be the fire that feeds us. And I went away for a period of time, and I really learned that feeling in that space of greatness, that sense of community and the kokua that we can do, the incredible ike and love, that boundless love that our ancestors have for us and our community has for each other, that is worth fighting for. And so I grew up, for me, on the east side of Oahu, and it's because of the lifeline journey of our family that side hasn't been overdeveloped. Waihole, Waikane, Kahana, now up north, Malai Kahana area with the Turtle Bay, desire to expand. There is a reason why that whole coastline isn't developed. It's because people like you and my parents and, the Hakipu'ohana and the Rapoons and people just like you, everyday people. And so one of the things I came to realize as I grew older is that the extraordinary is not commonplace, but it is something that is everywhere. And so being a part of that society, being a part of that community, I just wanted to be, I wanted to be like the folks that I love and made me proud. So one of the things that I did, I think I started speaking with environmental, speaking internationally on environmental topics. The first time I did that was at 12 years old at the an Environmental Action Coalition at the East West Center. And then from there, we started forming, there's Aloha Aina group that helped support the Paiohana with the PASH struggle, and then also went to medical school because of the inspiration of Papa Kekuni. And from there, I also became involved with the Standing Rock Healers Council. Actually helped, I was a co-founder of that, and more recently, standing on the front lines with Mauna Meta Sui. So I think that there's, all of those things are direct. I also think that movement has mo'okuauhau as well. So all of those things were a direct movement and inspiration from all the work that we did. And I'm quite proud of the more than 20 years of work that we did with the Onipa'ana Hui Kalo, because before we started doing these Hawaii-wide work days, it was almost unheard of to have these, lo'i kalo. And so we helped revitalize a lot of those things, like Rokava'a said, the board and stone movement came out of that. As far as the Aipono movement, part of that was also an outgrowth from that. Hakipo Ohana identifies that Onipa'ana Hui Kalo was a part of that. The Aipono came partially from that, just because one, you couldn't do Aipono if you didn't have enough Kalo, and then two was just the Ike being spread throughout all the islands. So I think for me, the political and health is so intertwined, along with spirituality and the protection of our Aina. I don't think that there's any way that we can separate those, So, and I think that, but at the same time, here we are, with like a huge proportion of the people incarcerated right now, predominantly, disproportionately Kanaka Maoli.
Okay. You've mentioned Dr. Kekuni Blazel twice.
Yes.
And for those who don't know him, he was a very early activist, as well as a physician. And you said that the politics and health are entwined, yes. That you can't have one without the other if you're looking at social justice issues. Mm-hmm. So you're a physician. You have a history by genealogy, mo'okuauhau, of activism and resistance. How have you integrated all of that contemporarily with yourself?
So I think that the part of how working with the Taro Farmers Association, I just became the kauka that made it possible for us to go and literally support thousands of people and train them on how to open up lo'i. And we did this mostly by hand with sometimes chainsaw, more often things like just regular steel o'o, as well as machetes. And remarkably, we didn't ever have any serious injuries. It's because we helped, I was a part of supporting the larger safety effort, but we were always thinking with the iki of our ancestors, you got to be safe. Preparation is key, having the right tools is key, education is key. So growing up in that space, always taking a step back and putting the farmers first, I think came from a class consciousness of understanding how privilege can happen in medicine. And you going into those spaces, they always come into our spaces, right? University, medical school, clinics, hospital. Our community always comes into these spaces, and those spaces aren't always kind to them. So going into the spaces in the community, in the most rural areas, Waipio, there's out in, Keanai on Maui, Waihole, Kahana, going into those spaces where we weren't the people that were in control, but being supportive of the community in that way, I think is critical. And then, from there, that kind of helped me out to springboard the work that we did with Standing Rock Meta Healers Council, because when I went there, I saw Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle. She was one of the first people who was arrested in the path of that pipeline. And I said, you know what? All these skills, all of these gifts that we have. Here is an Indigenous rising of people who had supported us. You know, the First Nations people supported us multiple times. We can go there and support them, and we can learn from one of the biggest, largest global gathering of Indigenous peoples. So I went there as a haumana and as a support to help. You know, I'm kind of I was a medical director, clinical associate medical director previously, and there aren't very many people that in the front lines and the political activism that are also people that organize things, that come up with, you know, direct systems. It's often fighting the system, but within these spaces to organize them and to actually create and build huis and relationships. I went there to Standing Rock to be a support in kaka'o in that way, and brought the kino kalaimoku from you know, from our own traditions, and so shared it with them as say, hey, you know, this is basically what we see here in our traditions. Let me see what you have and try to help support creating this. And so at Standing Rock, here's another type of situation where, you know, we're there was one loss, you know, but that was through suicide, unfortunately. But literally about 100,000 people came through this place. And it was negative 60 degrees, intense during the winter with terrible police brutality. Not a single life, you know, other than that one in that situation. But on the front lines, not a single life was lost. People didn't die of hypothermia. So being there, the EK of being there, and the importance of being there on the global platform against fossil fuels, against, you know, climate destruction. The only way I could be there is because of that politics. But then I come bearing gifts of the skills that I've learned. And also being gifted with the knowledge of how to then implement it on Mauna Kea. Same thing over there of trying to protect people there, because in Mauna Kea, the people on the major front lines, those are kupuna.
Those were kupuna.
Those
Absolutely.
are kupuna. And my mother was there, aunties and uncles were there, but my mother was there. And she was one of the frontline people that even in the end, when they were on that first day in July, they had arrested some people. She stayed there and refused to go even if they said they were going to.
That was a strategy, wasn't it? That was a strategy because we hold in such high esteem our kupuna, and we knew that the police, who were also Kanaka Maoli, were going to treat our kupuna with care. Yeah.
Well, you know, I think that that's something that a lot of them thought that way as well, but there were also people at the end that had batons and mace, and they're ready to utilize them if ordered. That was from the Maui group of police officers that had previously injured, you know, one of our other kiai that was broadcast on social media. And so, you know, there was a strategy of that happening, and it was protective. But at the end, I can tell you right now, if they had told them to move in and hurt our kupuna, if that was coming from the top down, they would have done it. I believe that. I think most of them would stand down, but I think enough wouldn't. That our presence there was critical, because if there was, you know, you don't even have to be intentional. If you release pepper spray and tear gas upwind from kupuna with COPD, congestive heart failure, if something happened where, you know, a projectile, you know, from the tear gas was going in and people panicked and they fell over. People like my mother, who's on Coumadin and almost 80 years old, might fall and hit their head and die from that. So, you know, being able to be there to support our kupuna, thinking about all of the horrible things, knowing about police brutality and being able to anticipate it to minimize injury is, you know, it's a big part of the work that I do, which is kind of looking at even under those situations, you think about the worst case scenario and then you prepare to make sure it never happens.
Right. Let me move a little towards culture. This week you're going to be doing a presentation at a conference looking at humanism.
Yes.
Right? And my understanding is humanism is that embracing of the potential of human beings, including human rights, which you are so passionate about, but it also subjugates the spirituality. So humanism is putting human beings over the divine or spiritual entities. And spirituality is such a critical foundation for our culture. So I'm wondering how or whether you put that together for yourself. How do you manage that, or how do you perceive that, and how do you operate within that, if at all?
Well, I think that people like yourself and myself are used to walking in both worlds, right? So it's really challenging when you bring them together, but it's critical because it's that language of communication, that attempts of people working together, is how we're going to actually survive. To reach over that bridge of, wanting to come from this place of, ethics, like the strongest ethics, brilliant minds, to be able to reach over and have that discussion and bringing more brown voices into these spaces to then say, science and spirituality. We married that as Kanaka Maoli, right? That was, the gods were in the fresh water springs. They were in the fresh streams that came down. They were in the clouds from the sky. And you could know how certain medicines would then affect you, and when you pollute those medicines, how it affects you. So, ole kawai, mini wachoni. That there is this larger picture that goes beyond the individual, right? Where understanding that in traditional times, Aina, when you look at that which feeds you and nurtures you, Kanaka Maoli and Aina were one. They were never separated. The only time they separated was in the trying to turn it into the Western laws of then making land to be purchased and sold and bartered, rather than being in an ancestral connection together. So I think what's really important is for us as Kanaka Maoli to, and not just us, but Indigenous peoples all over the world, to teach people about sustainability. We talk about capitalism, we talk about socialism, communism as different systems. In the book and the work that I'm doing right now, working on right now, I talk about indigenism. So indigenism is a part of understanding that we as Indigenous peoples are a part of a larger system. And there might be governments, and there's deoccupation, decolonization, that part of it's really important. But we also have to look at how are the systems of our people that made it possible for us to be healthy. How do we need to re-bring them back? How they're scientifically based? How lo'ikalo are actually, nature preserves? How they actually support the environment and add to it rather than subtract from it? How that kalo is one of the most healthy whole foods that you could possibly eat, and how it nurtures us as a people is hand in hand with the fact that Haloanaka is an older sibling. So there is, I think that often people think, and they put science into this one field, but I think for us, for a lot of our science, and we say spirituality here, but for us as Kanaka Maoli, science and spirituality was one.
That's right.
We created the songs and dances so that science wasn't inaccessible to everybody. Right now, people talk about COVID and the vaccine and mRNA, all those types of things. And the vast majority of people have no idea what that means. But if you talk to people who know the chants of their ahupua'a, they know about the gods that are in that area that represent the river, and that you have to treat that sacred space as sacred. Otherwise, it endangers everyone.
Well, also science looks different to Kanaka Maoli, yes, to Indigenous people. I'm a hula dancer, and we dance about Pele. And for years, I was kind of clueless and just kind of danced about Pele and thought it was a fabulous story. But, one of the things that I had heard was in Volcano, there's this question about, was Halema'uma'u the result of one big giant eruption, or was it the result of several eruptions? And a Native Hawaiian person there said, you know, if it was one big giant eruption, we would have a mo'olelo about that giant eruption. We don't have a mo'olelo about that giant eruption in our history. So we think that Halema'uma'u came about through a series of eruptions. But that's how we manifested our science in chants and oli. And I think there's a mindset about looking at that and evaluating that mo'olelo with respect to the natural environment. You know?
Absolutely, and you know, there's those are the types of things like that I wrote recently in the Indigenous resistance in the climate change era of climate change crisis, is where you have these songs that not only told you the songs, but they told you the direction of the stars and how they rose and set, and made it possible for us to use traditional means to then circumnavigate the globe. And so here we have these songs, and again, it comes back down to, you might understand a part of that mo'olelo. Like people talk about the kumulipo and the, you know, in the darkness, the pole, we have the single-celled organisms that became the multi-celled and then became, you know, here is a story of creation that is then accessible to everyone. And it's not on Palapala, but it's science. It's very scientific. And I think it's one of the things that they always, you know, during the struggle in Mauna Kea, you know, saying it's culture versus science. It's like, no, 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 no. It's your science dismissing our science.
Exactly, exactly. You know, can I talk a little bit about the pandemic?
Oh yeah, of course.
You know, the pandemic has uncovered health inequities, not just with us, but throughout the nation.
And
with,
the world.
You know, the African Americans, the Micronesians here in Hawaii. And you know, we talk about social determinants of health, and that's why we had such a poor reaction to COVID. But there's a systemic issue that often doesn't get discussed when you talk about social determinants of health, which is very individualistic, which is very Western. But when you step back and look at systems issues that have created or impacted those social determinants of health, we come away with a different understanding of that. And my guess is that you have looked at that with a very precise lens. And I'm wondering if you could talk about some of those issues.
Sure, and I think that there's part of what we're looking forward to in this conference that we're doing, you know, looking at global humanism. And global health and inequity is really looking at how, you know, they talk about, you know, people, we're screening, you know, people for, you know, food insecurity, you know, housing insecurity, talking about, you know, identifying their appropriate gender, you know, that they identify with. And here you have this whole structure where you're looking at it and you're saying, this is something you're having a problem with that might affect your health, and just kind of putting it in this little hole for people. And, you know, to a certain extent, blaming them for their own health issues. So here we have somebody who's depressed and having that depression, but they're not looking at the fact that here we are, their mother has cancer. There's, you know, they had to adopt their sister's children because they're in ICE. And they're here in this world where they don't have you know, the minimum wage in Hawaii is not a living wage. They can't afford a home. They're working 2 or 3 jobs which refuse to give them appropriate health care. And therefore, they're making too much money in order to qualify for Quest, which I call the working wounded. And taro farmers are often in that category where they make just enough where they can't qualify for it. But they just barely are making it. And we're telling them that they're not worth it, that health is not a human right, and that it's their fault for these problems that are happening when they know in their bones it's not. So when people are saying on Mauna Kea, you know, we will come in with billy clubs and mace and hurt your kupuna in the name of this project that the community has been opposed to for generations. Here we have this situation where people are rising up and they're saying, we're going to hurt you and hurt the people that you care about and the land that you care about. But then literally that same month, in March, when they call for shutdown, for pandemic, and for teaching and education, we're supposed to then look at EG on the screen and think our people are going to be like, oh yeah, we're going to follow you. This person has my best interest in mind, when they have demonstrated that they haven't. So it's not, our people aren't stupid just because you don't provide education system. That we know that something is fundamentally wrong. And when we don't address this within the health situation, people come to me angry, infuriated all the time. And I tell them anger is it's a healthy reaction to an unjust and unfair situation. However, how are you going to turn that into something that you can help survive the situation? And I totally recognize that what happened in this situation is unfair, unjust, but let's take a moment to try and take care of yourself within this unjust structure and do what we can to make things a little bit better. But here we are, Kanaka Maoli don't have a primary care provider that they feel like they're bonded to and they trust, particularly on the islands of Mokuokeave, Kauai. Such a critical shortage of access to be able to provide services and care to somebody. So how are you going to have that one-on-one conversation? The only thing that teaches you about COVID and vaccines are safe is EG on the screen. And I also appreciate Dr. Josh Green because he did come to the Mauna, to help us and support us. But a lot of people didn't know what his role is, and a lot of people don't know him. So I understand why people don't trust him. But then he's lieutenant governor associated with this governor. So we're supposed to expect that our people are going to then trust them to tell them that the vaccines are safe. This is a perfect example of how one person gets hurt and then everybody gets hurt. If you have the systemic oppression, the systemic lack of access to resources, how in the world are people going to trust and understand what is the science behind that? Because that science has been rigorously walled off from them and denied. People are not getting taught about mRNA adequately in high schools. There are high schools that don't even have enough tables for everybody to sit on and enough books for people to take home. So all of that is a part of why there's a failure of public health that's happening. And this is by no means going to be the last pandemic. I don't know if we're going to have one in 100 years or sooner than that. But if we don't get it together and understand how this distrust of health system goes, if we get hit with another one or even another surge with a really bad variant, not the Omicron one, which was milder than the other ones, how are we going to protect each other?
I do some work with the medical school in the Department of Native Hawaiian Health, and I do some training of medical students. And one of the things that we encourage is for medical students and residents and young doctors to be in the community, to be able to stand as a community person. Because one of the things that I hear stories about is if you're not in the community and you're working in a geographical area where their poverty is prominent. I have heard stories of doctors saying to patients, you really need to eat better. You need to eat fresh fruits and vegetables, and you need to exercise more. Well, if you live in a community where there's no grocery store that sells fresh fruits and vegetables, and you live in a community that's pretty dangerous to go out there and walking around, how do you do that? And as a physician, as a healthcare professional, what do you have to do to compensate for that, and what kind of responsibility do you have as a physician in that environment, perhaps? So let me ask, I know the work you do as an activist looking towards social justice. As a physician, what are some things that you do to address the issue of health inequities in Hawaii?
So one of the things that I talk about in some of our writing is that we are asked, those of us who are really looking towards a future where our people are not just surviving, but we're actually thriving. We are being asked, those of us, those of you who are out there working so hard to help our peoples, a very unfair question to do, a very unfair responsibility. One, we're supposed to survive this current system while simultaneously preparing for a future that we can see as, possibility, the dream of what a Maoli Honua implemented would look like and feel like for our people. And each job is terrifyingly hard, but we're being asked to do so. So one of the things that my family taught me is that you have, 1 foot in the community always, 1 foot towards your survival. And throughout my work, I try to have work that always is in coinciding with my ethics. But I don't ever think that that's going to feed my dreams. It'll feed my belly and give me shelter. But I also recognize that the things that feed my dreams that are part of, and I'm not saying everybody, some people are lucky enough to do both. But for me, to have truly radical, revolutionary huli, huli here, to have that, I have to be able to step out into these spaces. And that's why I'm out in the community where it's not a doctor situation, but it's a taro farmer situation. I'm out in the community where it's not just, healthcare providers, preaching, it's us supporting to make sure the health and well-being of our community is there. And then also creating systems, of education and looking at these structures and also just recognizing the great work of people like you who are doing this kumuhula work in the prisons. And I'm actually super curious to learn a little bit about your work and how you started getting work there and how you got inspired to do this and how you feel that really affects the ola of our people who are incarcerated.
Well, thank you for asking. I retired as a social worker in 2015. I retired from the School of Social Work as well as from Women's Way, which is a residential treatment center for pregnant and parenting women. I danced hula all my life. I unikied or graduated as a kumu hula, and I knew that I wanted to volunteer to work in the jail because the women in the jails were the women I was working with at Women's Way. And I was always so impressed at how these women got up every morning with hope. Despite the trauma, despite the pain, they woke up every morning and they said, I'm going to do it today. So when I approached the administration at the women's jail, I approached it and I said I wanted to not just do hula, but I wanted to do hula as healing. And I wanted to establish a halau in the women's jail because when you have a halau, you have a structure. You have a structure by which haumana know how they're supposed to behave. I have a structure by which I can teach hula. There are rules about how you hold yourself in a halau. And that's what I wanted to teach besides just hula. So it has been really satisfying. And, one of the stories I hear, a lot of the stories I hear from the women are, I used to dance hula until I got into drugs. I used to dance hula until, and then some trauma happened. And I can see the women's na'au shine as they're dancing hula, as they're coming to an understanding about what this hula is about. And I try and choose hula and oli that the women can relate to. When you dance about pele, you're dancing about power and control, right? And these women know something about power and control. We're dancing about hi'iaka, whose loyalty gets her into big trouble, right? And whose powerful sister Pele negatively impacts her. So the women in the jail, they can relate to that. And so when we have a discussion about it, they go, hey, Kumu, I know something about that. And I don't have to tease it out. They go, oh, Kamapua, I know that story. You know, I thought the guy I was with was a stud. But you know what? He turned out to be a pig. and I don't have to say anything.
Right.
They get it. We dance about ahulili, jealousy. Yeah? They get it. And you can see them dancing. It's their story too. You know, so it's just really rewarding.
And so healing, I bet, for both them
healing.
and you.
And you know, one of the things we know about healing is that part of healing is the ability to tell their story and to tell their story to people who listen with great aloha. And so they can tell their story and people listen and they say, wow, she got it. This person got it. They know me, you know? And yeah, it is healing. It's healing for me. Yeah, it really is.
I had one of my friends who was one of the, in the leadership at Standing Rock. She's Lakota. Her name is Holyoke Lafferty. She's in the Mo'okuhau of the American Indian movement. And she said to me once, you know, the traumas that we heal this generation, the next generation doesn't have to carry. And I think that that's part of that, you know, the people that, sometimes people forget that the women in jail, incarcerated, they're mothers. They're sisters, and they are, even if they might be incarcerated for however long that they are, they have children that still love them, that need them, and that they bring home. And if they can heal that part of them, and if they can let their na'au really shine, then that part of that trauma, they don't have, that next generation that they have doesn't necessarily need to carry it. So I think that's beautiful. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
So amazing.
Thank you. So let me get back and ask you. You know, by legislation, Hawaii has really good access to health insurance. Yeah, I think it was called the Prepaid Act of 1970 something or something like that. But I'm wondering, given your work, are there areas where we fall short? Is there something more that Hawaii can do with respect to citizens of Hawaii accessing health insurance?
Well, I think that the fact you need to have a hula halau in a prison, you know, that tells it in itself. We're a part of this system in the United States where the largest population of its population is incarcerated on any place in the planet and any time in history. So the fact that so many people are incarcerated, rather than having things like domestic violence shelter, appropriate drug treatment, and actual viable housing situations that don't make them have to turn into, you know, professions that are highly dangerous, like, you know, drug trafficking. Those are the types of things that people have to do in order to actually support their families, you know. And the fact it's considered some of the best healthcare in the United States. But if we're doing so well with that, then why are particularly Kanaka Maoli on the top of almost every poor health indicator that we have? So here we have particularly, like I said, the kalo farmers. They're like perfect examples, hardworking, traditional people that have a real ike and a wealth, like just the wealth, the vai of these kalo farmers. And here they are struggling day to day to do things like put gas in their car and put gas in their tractors, or, you know, they're not covered by health insurance because they're selling poi they're selling poi in the community, you know, with the farmers markets. So just make too much, a little too much. So here we are, if we truly believed, you know, in healthcare as a human right and the humanity of everyone, you know, and that's where the humanism part that we can learn, you know, as Kanaka Maoli, is that we think we've been ingrained through people that have never had our best interests in mind to look down on people who are not making enough money to get private health care. We don't think to ourselves, why is it that there is a different type of access to health care at Kaiser versus the community health centers? Why is it that you actually are terrified of losing your job and you're willing to accept indignity if your child has cancer? You will take any type of abuse, any type of inhumanity in order to make sure your child has enough health care. Because if you go past a certain point, then you drop off and then you have to go into poverty and welfare. You know, so there, and then you have housing insecurity. So here's this, we have to look at the entire structure in which we're looking at that, and we have to stop listening to that voice that says people who are poor deserve less. If there was actually nationalized health care like there was during the time of the kingdom, they had a board of health, they had nationalized education, 98% literacy. Here we have so much more wealth, yet people in Hawaii are struggling so hard. So if they can, if people say, hey, you know, Hawaii has the best healthcare system, say, okay, so what? How come we're having such a hard time? You know, so I think that there's those types of situations, you know, at least, you know, I'm grateful because 20, 30 years ago, they would have never had a halal at the prisons. And so there are strides being made, and I just honor people like you and others, Papa Kikuni, you know, Dr. Carpenter, others doing great, incredible work. I think we're a part of.
Well, it takes a village, you know?
It does. And one of the things I mentioned in one of the last was like how, you know, what the idea is, like what happened to the village, you know? Like part of the thing is we say, oh, you know, it takes a village, but where are our villages? You know, Kalama Valley was a village. Now we talk about a village, digital villages, you know, emotional villages, but somebody's way over there on the other side of the island. Before, I remember when I was growing up, when times we were hungry and poor, people knew it from next door, and they were the fishermen. They would drop off fish for us. And there was somebody else that was down the road that made, you know, soybeans. They knew we were hungry, and they would drop it off, and they were literally walking distance from our home. So there was a time when local people lived in more actual villages, but then they're destroyed and raised down for places like Kalama Valley, and there's for places like, you know, what Waihole Waikani would have been, which was like pretty much a private gated community for rich people that our local people couldn't afford. So I think that we need to look at the metaphors. The important thing about the village, but we also have to remember, you know, why is the village destroyed? Why are we talking metaphors and not actual?
You know, let me go back to insurance, because I just remembered, and I hope I can say this, but I just remembered that Aloha Care is beginning to pay for cultural practices as a health intervention. So my understanding is that they're looking at funding one cultural practice at a time so that they can get this up and running. But they're going to be funding Lomi Lomi as massage. They're going to be funding Ho'oponopono as perhaps family therapy. I'm just using the Western comparison. And they're going to be funding hula as a viable physical activity, you know, because the Department of Native Hawaiian Health, if you remember, did several studies on hula for post-cardiac activities, and so they're going to do that. Amazing. So our cultural practices are going to be funded as viable health activities. Interventions, thank you. So I think that's great.
I think that like it's unimaginable, right? When we're like younger, yes, you know, to like even think that that would happen, you know? And I think that that's part of some good steps, But, you know, again, coming back to what is the dream? You know, so the dream should be that kumuhula don't have to worry about their hale. They don't have to worry about, you know, where they're going to live. That you don't have to be funded through an organization like Aloha Care in order to be able to do this treatment, that you could be there in the community, be surrounded by, not worry, like, you know, this is basically, you know, our kumu, we're cared for, you know, and our, like, and there's, you know, ho'oponopono, for me, you know, I'm happy that these movements are going into, like, you know, ho'oponopono and lomi lomi. I think that those are good directions, you know, but then there's also, just as far as I was taught, you know, I'm also a practitioner. I didn't uniki under Papa Hawaii, but I did work with him and learn from him as a kako, not like a primary kako, but like, you know, a koko actually, like, you know, below the kako, you know. So where, you know, where he taught us we couldn't ever, you know, pay for, you know, get it paid for those services. And so, and it really kind of came from a perspective of that, you know, here I am trying to heal people in 15-minute increments, you know, and here it is, I'm trying to provide this care, and, you know, he would sit with people the whole day, and it was okay because he'd, you know, live next door to them. So, you know, I think that that's something that, the key is, look at our you know, mokuahau, the alahele, see the pathway and how far it is, but let's never lose sight of also, like, you know, where we're trying to go for as well. But at the same time, like, you know, celebrate where we are right now. So the combination of doing all those things, I think, is how I keep hope.
So for genealogy, mokuahau, and the pathway,
yeah.
What, I don't know if I'm going to ask this correctly, but what do you want your descendants to know? How do you want your descendants to stand in their own truth, either as Kanaka Maoli, as citizens of Hawaii? How do you see your work, and how do you see your work supporting that journey so that our descendants can stand as healthy Kanaka Maoli?
That's hard. I'm still trying to figure out every day.
Here we are.
I think I'm still trying to figure out every day. In one way, I'm trying to write. So even though, you know, that's, you know, pala pala isn't really part of our tradition, it's historically, it has become a part of our tradition, you know, in recent times. So, and it also provides us some legitimacy doing research, writing, and presenting that. But also, as much as possible, you know, like for the Standing Rock Native Killers Council, we had 3,000 volunteers that were able to step into these spaces and learn this. At the Mauna Mea Killers Hui, there was 300 people that were part of it. Oni Pa'ana Huli Kalo, maybe about, you know, 5,000 or 6,000 people participated in that, in their learning. So making it fully accessible, making it, you know, every day, making it a part of everybody's, you know, waking experience, that Maoli Honua is something that is accessible for us all. It's not just for somebody that has a college education or a degree or is rich and is able to do these types of things, but it's accessible to all. And so that's what my family tries to do, is try to make it possible that it's accessible to everyone.
I think accessibility is important. As you said, there's all kinds of people moving towards something positive for a lahui. And because I'm a ho'oponopono practitioner, I want my descendants to practice ho'oponopono on an everyday basis. So those of us who practice and teach ho'oponopono, the traditional family-based ho'oponopono, our rallying cry is a ho'oponopono practitioner in every family.
Nice.
Yeah? And for those of you who are activists, e holomua, you know, move forward, resist, fight. We all need each other, and using our own skills and passion to move forward on that same path. Yeah, so we would all have a healthy lahui.
Ew.
You get the final words. Anything you haven't said that you want to say? And
well, I liked what you said about your ohana, the ohana, you know, your mana'o, or the I think like what I always say in our, our ohana, like the velo, the defining characteristics of your ohana. I think one of the ones that my mother considers kind of like a ohana motto is plant the huli in the ground, spear up. So every day you kanu for a crop that will not be available for a year. And you keep on planting. You plant and you plant and you plant and you laugh and you sing while you're doing it. But you keep your ihe ready, because unfortunately we know that anything that we build of beauty and grace and love, inevitably there'll be a time when we will be called upon to defend it. So I call upon everyone out there to bring a healer, a ho'oponopono, a la'au lapa'au, a kauka. In every household, I say also bring a farmer into every household, and somebody that, feeds everyone and makes it possible for the healers of the world to step forward and focus on healing. Just heal. We all are like the kino kalaimoku. Yeah, you have to have the right hand, the left hand, the right foot, the left foot, and then all of it, always the po'o, which is the aina, to guide us all. The aina of our people and the aina of our land together as one, so that we can actually bring together the fractured pieces of our kino, so we can walk together whole and healthy into the future.
So mahalo nui loa no ko ike a me a mana'o. Thank you so much for your knowledge, for your mana'o. And as you were talking about your mom planting kalo, you have planted seeds in our audience today. And I hope that you have opened up the passion of people who want to follow what you do, activists, healthcare, and just e holamua. E holamua kako. Mahalo.
Mahalo.